So while the British were fucking over China, they were also fucking over India quite badly.
No. Why did I never know about this? Also, what happened to all the opium produced in India? Where the fuck did it go? The nation wants to know.
Sure.
Oh, that rhymed.
Okay. So the East India Company's opium monopoly in Bengal and Bihar exploited millions, right?
Hmm.
Through forced cultivation, through debt cycles, and we are going to get into that, through also child labor. And they were generating massive profits while fueling what we spoke about earlier, the famine, and also peasant
Hmm.
revolts, right? And yields peaked at around 58,000 chests with around 65 kgs each times 58,000 annually by the year 1830s. Yeah. Okay.
Hey.
I found an extensive research done by this gentleman called Dr. Rolf Bauer. He's a professor of economic and social history at the University of Vienna. And BBC interviewed him. They write about Dr. Bauer just to give you an idea of the amount of research that went into this. So the BBC article says, for years, Dr. Bauer trawled through archival documents looking at the costs of producing opium and paying money to farmers. He also examined an exhaustive history of the trade, the 1895 report of the Royal Commission of Opium, which ran into 7 volumes and 2,500 pages. It contained 28,000 questions and hundreds of witness reports on the use and consumption of opium in India and studied how the colonial government regulated its production and consumption. So, this man is reliable, right? He's done a
Hmm.
lot of work. So, let's get into,
I
yeah,
have one question. How much opium did he consume
he
during the
didn't.
research?
I have to give him the benefit of doubt and assume that he did
I'm
not.
sorry, then I don't believe a single word he's saying now. Without that first-hand experience and information, how can I trust you to give me the objective information if you haven't tried the product itself?
Because it's not
The
about
product that you're
consumption.
researching in the first place.
It's not about consumption as much as it is about production. So we are good, Sandy.
He clearly can't produce it on his own, no? So
Okay,
he
so
had to consume.
we are going to get into what he found. So the
Disappointed. Sandy is very disappointed.
okay, so the same BBC article says this is how the East India Company ran the trade. Some 2,500 clerks working in 100 offices of a powerful colonial institution called the Opium Agency monitored poppy farmers, enforced contracts, and quality with police like authority. Indian workers were given commissions on every seer. A seer is a traditional use of mass and volume used in like many parts of Asia. Okay. So every seer of opium delivered on their beat. In the thriving state-run global trade, exports increased from 4,000 chests per year in the beginning of the 19th century to more than 60,000 chests by the 1880s. Opium, says Dr. Bauer, was for the large part of the 19th century the second most important source of revenue for the colonial state. It was only outmatched by land taxes. We know very, very well about land taxes, right? The
Hmm.
the revenue system, the revenue collection system, and we have spoken about this briefly in a previous episode, that the revenue collection system with land taxes was extremely exploitative, right? The government's opium industry was one of the largest enterprises on the subcontinent, producing a few thousand tons of the drug every year. A similar output to Afghanistan's notorious opium industry today, which supplies the global market for heroin, Dr. Bauer says. More importantly, the crop, he adds, had a lasting negative impact on the lives of millions. Interest free advance payments were offered to poppy farmers who could not access easy credit. By itself, this was not a bad thing for those producing the global market. What made it bad for them, according to Dr. Bauer, was what they paid for rent, manure, irrigation, and hired workers was higher than the income
Hmm.
from the sale of raw opium. And we are going to get into that, how exactly this was bad, right? Like what they were paying. In other words, the price peasants receive for their opium did not even cover the cost of growing it. and they were soon trapped in a web of contractual obligations from which it was difficult to escape. Stiff production targets by the Opium Agency also meant farmers, the typical poppy cultivator was a small peasant, could not decide whether or not to produce opium. So they took away that
Mm.
agency as well, right? They were forced to submit part of their land and labor to the colonial government's export strategy. Local landowners forced their landless tenants to grow poppy, and peasants were also kidnapped, arrested, and threatened with destruction of crops, criminal prosecution, and jail if they refused to grow the crop. It was a highly coercive system, Dr. Bauer says. Right? So let's break this down, right? What was actually happening here? Basically what Dr. Bauer calls the agency system, right? And I've taken
Mm.
this part from a paper that was published at the University of Vienna by a student, but under the guidance of Dr. Bauer, right? So the agency system, it's broken down into four parts, right? First part, the East India Company made sure that they were the only ones producing opium, right? Which meant that private cultivation of poppy, the production of opium, and its trade were made illegal. So other than
Mm.
East India Company, nobody else could produce, right? Then licenses were given to small farmers, allowing them to officially grow poppy and produce raw opium. So first you restrict every other form, and then you give license to small farmers to produce poppy, right?
Mm.
East India Company officials working at the opium department closely followed this work process, monitoring the peasants. The third part, there were predetermined prices. Now, this is the production part, right? Now, let's talk about what happens when the poppy is produced and harvest season comes in, right?
Mm.
So, there were predetermined prices for the opium. And when the harvest season approached, the farmers had to sell their full intake of raw opium to the East India Company according to these prefixed prices, right?
Mm.
So low quality of the product was punished with less money, and they even levied fees and taxes on them for low quality. So not only are you selling at a lower price than you would sell in a free market. Free market exists only and only for the West. It doesn't exist for people they are colonizing, right? But also, if the British determined, if the opium department determined that this was low in quality, they would have to pay taxes. The peasants would have to pay
Mm.
taxes, right? And the final fourth part, after the raw opium was officially handed over to the East India Company agents, it was brought to one of the two factories that they managed, right? Which were also owned and operated by the East India Company. There, the raw produce was made into the finishing product and assembled into balls of opium. And then they were pulled onto huge these chests, right? Like big wooden crates, and then which were called chests. And then these
Mm.
chests were were transported into Calcutta. Here, the drug was auctioned off to private merchants. So all of the now auctioning means massive profit, right? So all of the profit was retained by East India Company because you're buying
Mm.
at a low fixed price and selling at an auction at a bid, right? So it's obviously a huge profit margin. These merchants, private merchants, then sold the drug to China or wherever they wanted to, mostly China. That meant also that for the East India Company, the responsibility of the opium ended officially in Calcutta. So they covered
Mm.
their bases everywhere, right? At the cost of everyone else, at the cost of these private merchants. I don't have too much sympathies with them, but they were there. At the cost of the farmers, at the cost of Chinese citizens, at the cost of China or the officials, everybody, right? East India Company was the only one that was gaining. Plus, there was the issue of labor conditions. So each harvest season required the workers to work 100-hour weeks for 12 weeks at a stretch. Might I remind you that the
Mm.
pay does not increase. It's not minimum wage system. So the pay is not increasing on, there's no wage. You're producing at your own cost. You've bought the license. You're producing at your own cost, at your own labor, and you are still selling at the same price. So 100 hours
Mm.
weeks for 12 hours at a stretch, you are not being compensated for it, right? To give you an example of what was happening, Karl Trocky, he's a historian, he says this about the opium production in Patna. I am quoting. In Patna, there were 1,000 men employed as cakers. Cakers were the ones who were making them into those balls. 1,000 men were employed as cakers who worked from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day in the huge sheds erected for the factory. They labored through the hot season in temperatures up to 40 degrees Celsius. A bell was rung every 20 minutes and each cake maker's output was checked. The average output for the Patna factory was between 16,000 and 20,000 cakes daily. Now, during the lead up to the first Opium War, India was suffering as much as China was. The only and only people gaining were the British.
Britishers.
Yeah, right?
And they were not even getting high at the same time, dude. It's not as if at the very least you can be like, okay, fine, I've grown this, might as well enjoy a little bit of it. I'm sure they must be tracking that as well,
Yeah,
right?
there were very, very strict, like we have discussed, very strict regulations in place, right? I mean, you don't have food to eat. Who's thinking about getting high at that time? You don't have the ability
Fair
to
enough.
survive,
That's fair.
right?
That's fair. Yeah.
So this was during the first Opium War.